in the last video we learned that we can simplify rational expressions. Now, one of the important parts about rational expressions is the fact that we're going to have one expression in the numerator and one expression in the denominator. In order for a rational expression to be valid, it cannot have a denominator of 0. So whatever the expression in the denominator is, it cannot equal 0. So this requires us to find the values that would make the denominator 0 and exclude those values. And so when we do that, we call that value, or those values, the excluded value. And so the simple way to do this is to simply make the denominator equal to 0. If we make the denominator equal to 0 and solve for the variable at that point, that will tell us the value or values that would make the denominator 0 and thus make the rational expression undefined. So we can have two parts to these problems. We can simplify the rational expressions, and we may also ask you to find what the excluded values are. Now, solving for the excluded value is going to become very important for next school year, whenever you start to solve and graph rational equations and graphing the rational function. So very important that you understand the concept of an excluded value. So let's take a look at sample problem 1. We ask you to do two parts here. We ask you to simplify in part A, and then we ask you to find the excluded value in part B. So go ahead and just pause the video and work those two parts at this time. Okay, so if we recall from the previous lesson, we want to simplify a rational expression, and the way that we do that is we have to factor the top and the bottom. So you need to know your factoring parts, and we have on the top expression we have just a basic trinomial, a quadratic expression, and so I'm going to factor that, and that breaks into x and x. And 6 can break down in this case to 6 and 1. And then we need to get our signs correct. So in this case the larger number is negative and the smaller number is positive. So we have factored the numerator. Now we need to factor the denominator, which gives us a difference of squares. So I can break that up into x and x. 1 and 1. Of course that gives me a positive 1 and a negative 1. And if you look at this, you can see that the numerator and denominator have a common factor, and that's x plus 1. So we can cancel out those x plus 1s, which will simply leave us with an x minus 6 on top and an x minus 1 on bottom. And remember, the x values are like terms that are part of a bigger term, so they cannot factor out. So that is our final simplified answer, x minus 6 over x minus 1. Now, part B says to find the excluded value. I'm going to put a little part in here because sometimes it'll be more than one value. And if you recall, we said to find the excluded value, we make the denominator equal to 0. X squared minus 1 equals to 0. And so we would then just simply solve for the individual parts. So we're going to have x squared equals to a positive 1, and now we're going to take the square root of both sides, which is going to be plus or minus 1. So our excluded values here are plus and minus 1. What that tells us is if we were to take a positive 1 and plug it in for x in the denominator, that would give me 1 squared minus 1, which equals a 0, and that would make the rational expression undefined. The same would happen with negative 1. If we square negative 1, that's going to still give us a positive 1, and positive 1 minus 1 is going to give us 0. So that is a good example of simplifying rational expressions and also finding excluded values for rational expressions.